The regional director, Henderson, cleared his throat, the sound echoing unnaturally in the hushed sales room. He then announced without preamble that David's account portfolio would be reallocated. Other reps avoided eye contact, shuffling papers. Some people, Henderson added, a thin smile on his lips, just can't handle the big leagues, can they, Olson? The words hung, leaving David feeling cold, exposed. The garage door groaned its usual complaint just after 7:30. David looked up from the evening news, the familiar clatter of Sarah's keys on the ceramic entry table, a beat too slow. She didn't usually work this late, not unless a brief was due, and no brief was due tonight. The clinking of ice against glass followed, then the heavier slosh of liquid. He heard her sigh before she appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a highball glass. It was nearly full, the amber liquid swirling with 2 cubes. Bourbon. That wasn't like her either, not on a Tuesday. Long day? David asked, turning off the television. The sudden quiet of the house felt larger, hollower than before. He watched her cross the kitchen, setting the glass on the granite counter. Her briefcase thudded softly against the base of the island. Sarah didn't answer immediately. She ran a hand through her short, dark hair, pushing strands away from her forehead. Her shoulders were stiff under the fabric of her tailored suit jacket. She pulled off the jacket, draped it over a chair back, then unbuttoned the top button of her silk blouse. The air in the room seemed to tighten around them. Something happened, she said finally, her voice low. She picked up the glass, took a long swallow. David waited. He folded the newspaper he hadn't been reading. Is it about Frank Jensen? He asked. The name came out flat, already tasting like trouble. He'd heard enough about Frank Jensen, the senior partner, the firm's rainmaker, the man with a reputation for sharp elbows and wandering eyes. Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the condensation collecting on her glass. She took another sip. He cornered me today, she began, the words coming out in a slow, deliberate cadence, like she was reciting a deposition. In the file room, I was pulling some old documents for the Westfield merger prep. He just came in, closed the door behind him. She didn't look at David, stood too close, blocked the aisle. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the glass down again. He just stood there for a minute, looking. David felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He watched her face, searching for something, but her expression was carefully blank. What did he say? David asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Sarah exhaled a short, humorless breath. He said, and I'm quoting here, "That skirt does amazing things for your ass, counselor." The words hung in the air. David felt a rush of heat, instant and fierce, prickling beneath his skin. He pushed himself up from the kitchen table. He said that? And then he talked about the Westfield case, Sarah continued, ignoring David's rising agitation, about how important it was, and how opportunities sometimes arise for those who are amenable. She finally met David's gaze, and for a brief moment he saw a flicker of something raw in her eyes before it was quickly suppressed. That's sexual harassment, Sarah. Blatant, David said, his voice tight. He walked over to the counter, standing opposite her, his hands instinctively balled into fists. Then he forced them open, flattening them on the cool granite. Sarah gave a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound David rarely heard from her. Call it what you want, David. He runs that firm. He brings in most of the big clients. He's untouchable. She picked up her glass again, swirling the bourbon. Remember Lisa Hayes? The associate who left 3 years ago, or the one before her, what was her name, ended up leaving law altogether. The stories were office folklore, whispers that never reached an official complaint. David had heard them, but he had always dismissed them as gossip, not something that would touch their life. He took a breath, trying to steady his thoughts. You report him, or you walk out of that place tonight. You don't need this, Sarah. She shook her head, a decisive, almost stubborn gesture. No, I can't. Not now. Not with Westfield. This merger, David, it's my shot. It's what I've been working for these past 5 years. Her jaw was set. I have a plan. I'm going to maintain strict professionalism. I will not be alone with him, ever, and I'm going to document everything, every conversation, every interaction. David looked at her, at the steely resolve in her eyes, mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite name. Fear, exhaustion? He knew her ambition, her drive. Walking away was not in her nature, not when a goal was within reach. But the Bastiden, you promise me, David said, his voice low. You promise me you'll tell me everything, every single detail. You don't hold anything back. Sarah nodded, a quick, almost dismissive gesture. She raised her glass. It'll be fine, I'm handling it. But as she said the words, her eyes didn't quite meet his. There was a hardening around them, a subtle defensiveness that spoke of a battle already begun, one she was preparing to fight alone. A quiet dread settled over their home, an unwelcome guest. David watched her across the dinner table later, picking at her food. The usual easy rhythm of their evenings was gone. He sensed the immense burden she was now carrying, a weight he couldn't share, only observe. The unspoken tension between them was a heavy, persistent presence, thick in the air, tasting bitter. The first few weeks and after Sarah told him about Frank Jensen felt like a tense quiet. David watched her, noticed the way she'd stiffen slightly when the phone rang, or the quick, almost imperceptible flinch when she checked her work emails. Then, as weeks blurred into months, Frank's actions began to show a pattern. It was disturbingly calculated, a slow turn of the screw designed to wear her down. Sarah would come home, sometimes later than usual, and describe it. He started with the compliments again, she'd say, peeling an orange with precise movements. About my suit, or how sharp I looked. The words themselves seemed harmless, but the way Frank delivered them, the context, blurred the professional line until it was almost invisible. He'd say them in front of others too, just loud enough for her to hear, just subtle enough to avoid outright confrontation. Then came the physical contact. He touched my shoulder today, she told him one evening, her voice flat as she stirred pasta sauce. Just for a second. Said good work on the brief, Miller, but his hand lingered. Too long. Or she'd mentioned passing him in the narrow hallways, and he'd brush against her, a hand on her lower back, a feigned stumble. Each time, she said, his eyes would hold hers for a beat longer than necessary. The worst stories were from his office. He called me in this afternoon, Sarah recounted, dropping onto the couch, her briefcase still in her hand, closed the door. Then instead of going behind his desk, he sat down on the couch next to me. David felt a cold wave of revulsion. He pictured it, the forced intimacy, the power play. What did you do? David asked, his jaw tight. I just stayed standing, Sarah said, running a hand over her face. Walked over to the conference table, pretended to be looking for a pen, told him I preferred to discuss case strategy at a proper workspace, kept my voice even. She'd feign disinterest, she explained, make eye contact only when absolutely necessary, then break it to focus on a document, a pen, anything but him. Frank retaliated quickly. He said my due diligence on the Westfield financials was sloppy, Sarah reported a few days later, her frustration palpable. Then he took a section of my work, the most critical part, and gave it to Mike Schmidt. Mike Schmidt was known around the firm as a well-meaning but utterly incompetent associate, prone to missing deadlines and basic errors. It was a deliberate sabotage designed to undermine her and damage her performance on the most important case of her career. David watched her, seeing the effort it took for her to just breathe, let alone maintain composure. The emails started coming late at night. Urgent work matters, Frank would write, requiring her immediate attention. But tucked into the body of the message, sometimes in a parenthetical, sometimes a separate line, would be a personal question. Hope you're not working too hard, don't want you losing that glow. Or a comment about her appearance at a meeting that day. That blue suit suits you better than anything you've worn all week. David saw a few of them on her laptop screen, the insidious mix of professional necessity and personal intrusion. The invitations escalated too. He asked me to grab drinks to discuss a case, Sarah told him one evening, picking at her dinner. I said I had other commitments. Then it was dinner to review strategy. I said I had dinner plans. The excuses were becoming harder to invent, harder to make sound believable without sounding overtly dismissive. Then came the one that made David's blood run cold. He mentioned weekend mentoring sessions, Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper, at his place in the Hamptons. Said it would be a chance to really dig deep into the M&A process without office distractions. David stopped eating. The plate in front of him suddenly seemed irrelevant. He put his fork down with a quiet clink. The Hamptons? Sarah nodded, staring at her plate. And then he asked about you, she continued, her voice low. He wanted to know if we were serious. She held up her left hand, turning it slightly so the light caught the diamond of her engagement ring. Said domestic distractions can often derail a promising career, can't they, Sarah? David felt a hot wave of anger, a silent fury that made his hands clench under the table. Frank was not just harassing Sarah. He was actively trying to invalidate their life together, to dismiss David as a domestic distraction. It was a direct insult, a deliberate chipping away at their foundation. As the weeks bled into months, David saw the toll it took on Sarah. Her usual spark, that quick, bright energy, began to dim. She was exhausted, dark circles under her eyes even after a full night's sleep. Her focus, usually razor-sharp, was fractured. She'd zone out mid-conversation, her gaze distant, then snap back, offering a tight, apologetic smile. The constant mental gymnastics of fending off Frank's advances, of navigating the minefield of his office, was visibly wearing her down. David felt a suffocating helplessness. He watched the woman he loved, strong and capable, being systematically targeted. Her spirit slowly eroded by a man who wielded power like a weapon. Their once peaceful evenings at home were now tinged with anxiety, a quiet dread that settled into the corners of every room. The unspoken weight of Frank Jensen's presence was always there, a shadow between them. The sound of Sarah's keys on the entry table tonight wasn't just a clatter, it was a desperate clang. David, stirring risotto in the kitchen, felt an immediate unease. She walked in, dropping her briefcase with a thud David could feel in his teeth. Her face was pale, tight around the jaw. He did it, she said, her voice strained, barely above a whisper. Frank, he reassigned Becky. David turned from the stove, his spoon clattering against the pot. Becky Carlson was Sarah's paralegal, a sharp, efficient woman who had been her buffer, her witness, her invaluable ally. Becky? Why? Sarah ran a hand through her hair, a gesture David now recognized as a precursor to serious agitation. He said I'd be working directly with him on the Westfield case from now on. No middleman, no distractions. She kicked off her heels, one flying near the wall. It gets worse. He scheduled a strategy meeting in his office. Tonight, 8:30, just the two of us. David felt a cold, sharp shock, like plunging his hand into ice water. This was it. The move, the final blatant push. He put down the spoon, slowly, carefully, on the counter. You're not going, he stated, his voice flat, immediate, leaving no room for argument. Sarah whirled around, a rare burst of genuine anger flaring in her eyes. David, this is Westfield. This is everything I've worked for. This is my career. If I don't show up, if I say no, he'll find a way to sideline me, to cut me out. He'll say I'm not committed. He'll destroy my credibility. She was pacing now, a frantic energy vibrating through her. Mel, he's trying to... David began, the words catching in his throat. I know exactly what he's trying to do, Dio. Sarah cut him off, her voice cracking slightly. She gripped the back of a kitchen chair, her knuckles white. Do you think I don't know? Do you think I don't feel it every single damn day? David watched her, the raw frustration, the fear she usually kept so tightly reined in, finally breaking through. And then, an idea, desperate and half-formed, sparked in his mind. It was a long shot, a gamble, but it was all he had. What if I came with you? He asked, his voice calmer than he felt. Just showed up at the office, said I was meeting you for dinner. Something. Sarah stopped pacing. Her head snapped up. Her eyes, usually so guarded, widened slightly, and David saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen in weeks. Hope. And then relief. You'd do that? She whispered, the question loaded with an almost childlike vulnerability. They talked quickly, quietly, devising an impromptu sting operation. David would arrive at the Blackwell building, the imposing glass tower downtown, at 8:15 p.m. He'd tell the security guard he was meeting his wife for a late dinner, that she'd called him just now. He'd head straight up to the Blackwell firm's floor. David felt a knot of anxiety twisting in his gut as he drove. The city lights blurred past, a kaleidoscope of red and white. He parked, walked quickly across the polished lobby, past the security desk. "Evening," he said to the guard, forcing a relaxed smile. "Meeting my wife, Sarah Miller. Late dinner. She just called me." The guard nodded, already waving him through to the elevators. The ride up was interminable. His palms were sweating. He pictured Frank, pictured Sarah. What would he see? What would Frank be doing? He stepped out onto the hushed, carpeted floor of the Blackwell offices. The reception area was dark, but a sliver of light spilled from around the corner, from Frank Jensen's corner office. David walked toward it, his heart thumping against his ribs. The door was ajar. He pushed it open just enough to see inside. Frank Jensen stood too close to Sarah, one hand resting on the small of her back as they both leaned over a stack of documents spread across his large desk. The Manhattan skyline glittered behind them, a million indifferent eyes. Sarah was subtly leaning away from Frank, her body angled, maintaining what little professional distance she could. She was listening, nodding, but her expression was taut. David took a breath, forced a smile onto his face, and knocked on the open door frame. "Hey, honey," he called out, his voice perhaps a little too loud in the quiet office. "Thought I'd surprise you. Got out of the office earlier than I thought. Figured I'd whisk you away for that late dinner you mentioned." Sarah's head snapped up. Her eyes met David's, and the relief that flooded her face was immediate, tangible. It was like watching a sudden relaxation of a wire held under immense tension. Frank, however, stiffened. His hand dropped from Sarah's back. His expression flashed from annoyance, a raw, pure annoyance, to a forced, practiced geniality. He straightened, turning to face David, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Frank Jensen, I presume," David said, stepping fully into the room. He extended his hand, his gaze firm, unwavering. "David Olson. I don't think we've been formally introduced." Frank's hand was large, his grip firm, almost aggressively so, as he shook David's. "Mr. Olson, a pleasure. Sarah talks about you." He turned his gaze to Sarah, then back to David, a predatory glint in his eye. "She's a real asset to the firm. Dedicated, talented, and she knows how to dress for success, doesn't she?" "She's incredible," David agreed, holding Frank's gaze a beat longer than comfortable, a silent challenge passing between them, a line drawn in the bright light of the corner office. David's surprise visit to Frank's office had, for a brief spell, created a reprieve. Frank Jensen had maintained a polite, if strained, distance for a few days, but the initial deterrence was short-lived. Frank, a predator of long experience, simply shifted his tactics, finding new, more insidious ways to exert his influence. Sarah started describing subtle slights in meetings. "He'll bring up a point I just made," she explained one evening, her voice tight, "and phrase it like it's his own idea. Or he'll interrupt me, then say, 'Sarah's getting a little emotional. Perhaps she needs a moment to collect her thoughts,' even when I'm just laying out facts." The comments were always just under the radar of overt harassment, aimed at chipping away at her credibility with senior partners. David heard the quiet frustration in her voice, the impotent rage. He watched her withdraw. Her once vibrant energy, the quick laugh, the sharp focus, were slowly replaced by a quiet, gnawing anxiety. She barely slept, tossing and turning, then waking up bone-tired. Food held little appeal. She pushed it around her plate most nights. The strain began to fray their edges at home. Minor arguments flared over trivial things. The thermostat setting, a misplaced magazine. Sarah, usually so composed, would occasionally snap at him, a raw edge to her voice, then immediately apologize, her shoulders slumping. David felt a suffocating helplessness. His surprise visit had been a temporary bandage, a moment of fleeting triumph that had only forced Frank to dig deeper into his arsenal. It hadn't solved anything. It had only bought them a little time, and now that time was running out. Then came the texts, always late at night, sometimes after midnight. They were cryptic, unsettling. Frank wouldn't just send a memo or an email anymore. Sarah would check her phone, her brow furrowed. "Another one," she'd say, showing him the screen. Thought of you today, Sarah. You have potential others only dream of. Special opportunities await those who are ready to grasp them. Or, certain paths lead to fast tracking if one is brave enough to explore them. The messages were vague enough to deny, but the undertone was clear, a constant, low-frequency hum of expectation and implied reward. Whispers started circulating within the firm. Sarah didn't hear them directly, but she felt them. The subtle shift in how some colleagues treated her, the knowing glances, the averted eyes. She overheard a snippet in the break room. "Sarah's a little high-strung, isn't she? Difficult to work with sometimes." Or, "She gets too emotional about cases." Frank, it seemed, was subtly damaging her professional reputation, painting her as a temperamental woman incapable of handling the pressure, a narrative designed to isolate her. "He's been cutting me off," Sarah told David one Sunday morning, her voice thin. She was staring out the window, a cup of coffee untouched beside her. "He's been deliberately leaving me out of informal strategy sessions, not forwarding emails from other team members, making sure I'm not in the loop. It makes me feel alone." She turned to him, her eyes shadowed. "He's doing it so I don't have anyone to lean on, anyone to corroborate anything." They argued about next steps, their voices low, tight. Sarah was still fiercely protective of her career, terrified of doing anything that could be spun against her. "If I go to HR, it's my word against his, David. And he's Frank Jensen. They'll find a way to discredit me, say I'm unstable, ruin me." "We need proof," David insisted, his frustration mounting. "Something undeniable. What if you discreetly recorded your conversations? Just a small voice recorder, or your phone?" Sarah hesitated, chewing on her lip. "I don't know. What if they find it? What if that's considered unethical? A breach of firm policy? That could be used against me, too. It could look like I'm the manipulative one." The moral lines were blurring, shifting under the pressure. How far were they willing to go to protect her career, her dignity? What rules could they bend or break in the name of self-preservation? Frank's tactics had created a climate of fear. Sarah was constantly looking over her shoulder, reviewing every email, every conversation, every interaction, dissecting it for hidden meanings, for traps. A pervasive sense of quiet desperation settled over their tidy Midwestern home. The simple joys they once shared, the easy laughter, the comfortable silences, were now overshadowed by an ever-present anxiety. David realized his instinct to simply deter Frank wasn't enough. They needed a bolder, more decisive strategy. This wasn't just about Sarah's job anymore. The integrity of their professional lives, and implicitly, the very foundation of their personal one, hung precariously in the balance. David watched Sarah's distress deepen, a quiet erosion of the woman he knew. Her anxiety became a physical presence in their home, a constant hum beneath the surface of every interaction. He couldn't bear it anymore. One night, after she'd recounted another meeting where Frank had openly belittled her, David pushed, hard. "We can't just keep reacting, Sarah," he said, his voice low but firm, as they sat at the kitchen table long after midnight. "He's not going to stop. He's doing long-term damage to you, to your career, to us. We need to fight back properly, not just fend him off." The ensuing discussions were raw, intense. They laid out the immense risks like pieces on a chessboard: career suicide, defamation lawsuits, the humiliating glare of public scrutiny. "If this backfires, David," Sarah said, her voice strained, "I could lose everything. My reputation, my license. We could lose everything." But the fear of losing everything slowly gave way to a hardened resolve. Sarah, exhausted by the constant vigilance, by the psychological warfare, finally conceded. "He won't stop," she stated, her jaw set. "He'll never stop unless someone makes him." "Okay, we fight." Their strategy began with meticulous, covert documentation. Sarah, with David's help, cataloged everything: every date, time, location, every specific quote Frank uttered, every suggestive glance, every accidental touch. Names of potential witnesses, however indirect, were noted. David bought a tiny high-fidelity microphone online, no bigger than a button. He practiced with Sarah, showing her how to discreetly wear it, how to activate it, how to download the audio without leaving a trace. It felt clandestine, morally gray, but necessary. They started digging into Frank's past, casting a wider net. David spent evenings on his laptop searching old news articles, legal forums, anything that mentioned Frank Jensen. They looked for patterns of similar misconduct with other female associates at previous firms, whispers that might have been buried under NDAs or quiet settlements. With David's insistent encouragement, Sarah made a move she'd hesitated on for weeks. She cautiously contacted Lisa Hayes, Frank's former associate, the one who'd left the firm 3 years ago. They arranged a confidential meeting away from the firm at a neutral coffee shop on the edge of downtown. Sarah returned from the meeting pale but resolute. "She told me everything," Sarah whispered, sinking onto the couch. He did the same thing to her. The compliments, the touches, the late-night texts, the undermining in meetings. He systematically destroyed her confidence, then tried to isolate her. She just quit. She couldn't take it anymore. Lisa's story, traumatic as it was, strengthened Sarah's resolve, confirming their worst suspicions. The idea of becoming whistleblowers came up, but they quickly dismissed it. The firm would protect him, not me, Sarah reasoned. He's too valuable. They'd find a way to cover it up, spin it, and make me the problem. Sarah, now driven by a cold fury, unearthed old, seemingly innocuous emails from Frank, dating back months. Emails that, when cross-referenced with later events, with his escalating behavior, revealed a sinister undercurrent of manipulation, a deliberate cultivation of a relationship that blurred professional lines. David, meanwhile, created an anonymous email address and a few burner social media accounts. He used them to gather further intelligence, sifting through industry gossip, carefully worded posts from former employees of Blackwell and Finch. He even posted a few vague questions himself, fishing for information about Frank's reputation. It felt like living a double life, a spy in their own home. They spent an entire weekend drafting an anonymous, yet highly detailed letter. It outlined Frank's pattern of harassment, meticulously detailing dates, times, and quotes, cross-referencing it with the events Lisa Hayes had described. The letter was addressed to the firm's managing partners, carefully worded to sound like it came from a concerned but anonymous party, someone with internal knowledge, someone who cared about the firm's reputation. The psychological toll on both of them mounted. Sarah's anxiety was a constant companion, but now it was channeled, focused. David, for his part, became obsessive, meticulously planning every step, every contingency. They were partners in a secret, high-stakes war, a shadow campaign against a man who wielded immense power. Their shared purpose deepened their bond, but it also isolated them, drawing them into a world where only they understood the true nature of their battle. They looked at each other across the kitchen table, surrounded by printouts, timelines, and legal notes. How far were they willing to go? They were already operating in a moral gray area, engaging in covert recordings, anonymous information gathering. The ethical ambiguities inherent in their operations were stark. This was a different kind of battle, one where the rules were blurred and the stakes were everything. Stick around to the end to see how life's costly choices unfold. The anonymous letter, a tightly woven narrative of Frank Jensen's pattern of harassment, backed by a carefully selected portion of Sarah's documented evidence, was strategically deployed. They sent it to 3 mid-level partners, known not just for their legal acumen, but for a quiet, unwavering integrity. Men and women who, David reasoned, would not ignore it. Within days, a quiet internal investigation was discreetly initiated. It was a murmur rather than a shout, but the ripple effect was immediate. The firm's managing partners, keenly aware of the potential for a public relations nightmare, moved with an almost surgical precision. Yet, they encountered resistance. Frank Jensen, the firm's legendary rainmaker, had powerful allies, old friends, and colleagues who owed him favors. The wheels of justice, even internal ones, turned slowly and with considerable friction. Frank, a man accustomed to absolute control, sensed the shift in the office atmosphere. The whispers, the cautious glances, the sudden politeness of colleagues who had once been deferential. He became increasingly paranoid and aggressive. His interactions with Sarah, and even with others, grew erratic. He'd snap at associates, belittle partners in meetings, his usual smooth veneer cracking under the pressure. He began openly accusing Sarah. "Miller's been slipping," David heard her recount one night, her voice tight with suppressed fury. "Said I was disloyal for questioning his strategy on the Westfield case. Told another partner I was too emotional to handle the pressure." He was attempting to discredit her, to paint her as the problem before any formal charges could truly emerge. Sarah, though inwardly reeling, maintained her composure. She continued to gather evidence, meticulously documenting Frank's escalating erratic behavior. Each outburst, each thinly veiled threat, each bizarre comment was logged, dated, and stored. Then came the next crucial step. David and Sarah arranged for her to have an off-the-record conversation with Arthur Vance, a sympathetic senior partner with enough clout to make a real difference. Vance was known for his old-school ethics, a man who valued the firm's integrity above all else. He listened, initially skeptical, to Sarah's cautious retelling, but when she presented the sheer volume and consistency of her documented evidence, the emails, the detailed timeline, the cross-referenced stories, his skepticism began to waver. Then she played him a short, damning clip from a key meeting, recorded on her discreet device. Frank's voice, clear and unmistakable, making a thinly veiled threat about her future at the firm if she didn't cooperate. Vance's face hardened, his jaw visibly tightening. Next, they orchestrated a carefully planned, anonymous public testimony from Lisa Hayes. David, through his burner accounts, facilitated a connection between Lisa and a trusted independent legal blogger. Lisa's story, while protecting her identity from Frank and the wider public, was a chilling echo of Sarah's experience, providing further external validation to the internal investigation. The blog post quickly went viral within the legal community. Frank's high-powered legal team, sensing the tide turning, began to push back. They launched a counter-narrative, attempting to frame Sarah as a disgruntled employee with a vendetta, a woman driven by jealousy and ambition. They hinted at mental instability and character flaws, a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. Blackwell, Harding, and Pierce, the venerable law firm, faced an internal dilemma: protect their legendary rainmaker, a man who brought in millions, or prevent a catastrophic PR disaster and a potential avalanche of lawsuits that could dismantle their carefully constructed empire. The choice was stark, agonizing. Whispers of the internal investigation, of Frank's difficulties, began to leak beyond the legal blogs. A few local news outlets picked up on the story, discreetly at first, then with increasing fervor. Frank's untouchable image, carefully cultivated over decades, began to erode. His public persona started to crack. The usual composure was replaced by visible strain and anger, particularly during public appearances or when confronted by reporters. He looked haggard, cornered, inviting further scrutiny. David felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Their plan, conceived in desperation, was taking effect. But it was a satisfaction tempered by a heavy weight. He saw the destructive path they'd chosen, the mess they were creating, the lives potentially upended. Sarah, too, felt the burden. She looked at David one night, her eyes distant. "Even if we win," she murmured, "will it be worth it? All this, the fighting, the lees, the fear. What will be left of me, of us?" The immense personal cost, the moral compromises they'd made, weighed heavily on her. The tension within the prestigious law firm and within their quiet Midwestern home had reached a palpable breaking point, signaling an impending storm. The whispers became shouts, the leaks became a flood. Cornered and exposed, Frank Jensen shed any pretense of civility. His threats, once subtle, became direct, aimed squarely at both Sarah and David. He called Sarah late one night, bypassing her office line, using a number he must have gotten from an old firm directory. "You think you can take me down, Miller?" His voice rasped, cold and hard, over the phone line. "You and that milquetoast husband of yours? I know things about him, things he probably never told you. Financial troubles, little indiscretions." He paused, letting the implication hang. "I know where the bodies are buried, Sarah. Don't think for a second I won't start digging them up." David, listening on speakerphone, felt a cold dread. What could he be talking about? He'd never confided anything truly damaging to Sarah. Frank then shifted tactics, offering a bribe. "We can make this order go away." He hissed. "A substantial sum, enough to set you up for life away from here. No questions asked. You just drop this charade, disappear." Think about it, Sarah. Sarah, however, felt her resolve harden rather than waver. The disgust she felt for him now overrode any temptation. "No," she stated, her voice clear and steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I'm not going anywhere, Frank, and I'm not backing down." She hung up. Frank retaliated quickly. Within days, accusations began to circulate internally, alleging Sarah's own professional misconduct, a fabricated breach of firm confidentiality related to the Westfield merger. Suddenly, files were missing, emails were supposedly misdirected. It was a desperate attempt to frame her, to shift blame, to make her look like the unethical one. But David and Sarah had anticipated his desperate tactics. They had established contingencies for this exact scenario. For weeks, Sarah had been meticulously backing up every single document, every email, every interaction, mirroring the firm's records. When Frank's accusations surfaced, they had immediate, irrefutable proof that her files were intact, her communications clean. The fabricated evidence Frank presented crumbled under scrutiny. Then came their own counterstrike. They strategically released a series of anonymous video testimonies from Frank's former victims, women David had tracked down through his online sleuthing. These were not Lisa Hayes alone, but others, hidden, their faces obscured, their voices digitally altered, yet their stories were chillingly consistent, echoing Sarah's own experience. These videos, released through a carefully chosen independent news outlet and amplified by David's anonymous social media accounts, went viral within the legal community. The raw, unfiltered accounts of sexual harassment and professional sabotage created an unprecedented wave of public pressure on Blackwell, Harding, and Pierce. Law students were boycotting, former employees were speaking out, and prominent legal ethics professors were publicly condemning the firm's perceived inaction. The firm's executive committee, facing a PR catastrophe and the very real threat of major lawsuits, called an emergency, closed-door meeting. Frank Jensen was summoned. He was finally confronted with the overwhelming, irrefutable evidence against him. Sarah's detailed timeline, the audio recordings, Lisa Hayes' testimony, and now the viral videos from other victims. His lies, his manipulations, his predatory pattern were all laid bare before his peers, the very people he had cultivated and intimidated for decades. Frank reacted with an explosive, uncontrolled rage. David heard about it from Sarah, who heard it from her sympathetic senior partner. He denied everything, shouted accusations of conspiracy, threatened to sue the firm, to sue every single person involved. He lashed out, wild and desperate, a cornered animal. David and Sarah braced themselves for the final showdown. They knew Frank would fight dirty, pull every string he had left, leverage every secret he had. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a scorched earth campaign. The moral stakes intensified. David looked at Sarah, at the exhaustion etched on her face, but also at the fierce, unyielding light in her eyes. They were systematically dismantling a man's entire career, his public life, his reputation. It was a destructive path, one that would leave scars. But for Sarah, the fear and exhaustion were now mixed with a burning sense of righteous anger. She was determined to see justice served, not just for herself, but for all the women Frank had silenced, no matter the cost. The air in the marble lobby of Blackwell, Harding, and Pierce was thick with a strange anticipatory hum. David and Sarah stood near a cluster of ficus trees, waiting, their presence an unspoken statement. Then a commotion. Frank Jensen emerged from the elevator bank, flanked by two stone-faced security guards. He was disheveled, his expensive suit rumpled, his tie askew. His eyes, usually cold and calculating, were wild, bloodshot. "I'll destroy you, both of you," his voice echoed, unnaturally loud in the hushed space. Spittle flew from his lips as he struggled against the guard's grip. "You think this is over? I made this firm. I know where the bodies are buried." He was shouting now, his words bouncing off the polished marble. His eyes scanned the lobby, darting, desperate, then locked onto David and Sarah. A vein throbbed in his temple. With a sudden, desperate lunge, he tried to break free, but the guards held him fast. "You!" he screamed, his face contorted with pure, unadulterated hatred. "You think you're so clever with your videos, your anonymous testimonies. I know it was you, Miller. I know it was you and your pathetic little husband." Sarah squeezed David's hand, her fingers trembling slightly, but her voice was steady, calm, cutting through Frank's rage like a blade. "Goodbye, Frank," she said, her gaze unwavering. "I hope you find the help you need." Frank threw his head back and laughed, a maniacal, chilling sound that sent shivers down David's spine. "Help! I need help! When I'm done with you, you'll be lucky to get a job as a public defender in the Bronx, you little bitch. See how well you like working for minimum wage then." The guards hustled him toward a waiting elevator. Frank continued to curse, to rage, until the doors finally hissed shut on his contorted, furious face. A bizarre, heavy silence descended over the grand lobby, broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Partners, associates, and staff stood frozen, a tableau of silent witnesses. Many discreetly held up their smartphones, capturing the final, public downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. The firm's polished veneer had cracked, revealing the ugly truth beneath. David looked at Sarah, his grip tightening on her hand. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low. Her professional mask, the one she'd worn for months, slipped just enough for David to see the complex mixture of emotions warring within her. Profound relief, hard-won vindication, and a deep, lingering fear. "I will be," she whispered, the words barely audible. Then, with a visible effort, she straightened her shoulders, adjusted the lapels of her perfectly tailored blazer. "Let's get out of here." They pushed through the heavy revolving doors, stepping out into the harsh midday light of Madison Avenue. The roar of traffic, the indifferent bustle of the city, felt like a sudden immersion back into reality. David walked beside her, his mind replaying Frank's grotesque face, his desperate threats. He reflected on how quickly everything had unraveled for Frank, a man who, just weeks ago, had seemed to wield godlike power within his domain. The fall had been swift, devastating, and entirely of Frank's own making. A profound sense of exhaustion washed over David, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. It was coupled with a quiet, almost unsettling triumph. They had done it. They had won. But the victory felt complicated. Later that day, the firm issued a terse public statement, bland and corporate, about personnel changes within the senior leadership, and reaffirming their unwavering commitment to maintaining a respectful and ethical workplace environment. No mention of Frank Jensen. No mention of Sarah Miller. Just a quiet closing of the ledger, a sanitizing of the messy truth. But David knew, and Sarah knew, and now a significant portion of the legal community knew what had truly transpired. In the immediate aftermath, the legal community hummed with a low, insistent buzz. Media outlets, initially cautious, began to pick up the story, their phrasing careful, but the implication clear enough for anyone who read between the lines. Frank Jensen's downfall, though officially described as a resignation, was a scandal whispered behind closed doors and dissected in online forums. Within days, Sarah received an offer from Blackwell, Harding, and Pierce, a significant promotion to senior counsel, a substantial raise, and a promise of lead roles on upcoming major cases. It was a clear attempt by the firm to contain the fallout, to show they valued her, and most importantly, to retain her expertise and loyalty. It was, David recognized, a sophisticated form of institutional buy-off, a nudge to accept, move past the ordeal quietly, and become part of the solution rather than a lingering problem. Sarah grappled with the offer. David watched her pace their living room late into the night, the illuminated skyline indifferent outside their window. He saw the allure of the opportunity, the validation she'd worked so hard for, finally within reach. But he also saw the implicit pressure, the unstated expectation that she would now be their Sarah, the firm's success story, cleansed of any messy details. David, observing her turmoil, found himself questioning the true cost of their victory. Frank Jensen was ruined, his career in tatters, his name publicly shamed, but their own lives too had been irrevocably altered. The quiet desperation, the calculated maneuvers, the ethical compromises, had their revenge plot truly been a pure quest for justice, or had it subtly corrupted them, leaving a stain on their own integrity? The line between right and wrong had blurred, then dissolved, in the heat of the battle. After much deliberation, long, whispered conversations in the dark, Sarah made her decision. She declined the promotion. A few days later, she submitted her resignation, effective immediately. David felt a surge of relief, mixed with a profound sense of uncertainty. It was a gamble, walking away from the pinnacle of corporate law, but it was also a reclamation of herself. She spoke of seeking a new professional path, perhaps in public interest law, driven by a desire for genuine justice, for work that felt untainted by corporate politics and power plays. She craved a clean slate, a chance to build something new, something honest. David fully supported her decision. He had grown weary of the cutthroat world of Manhattan law, even as an observer. He was ready to embrace a simpler, more authentic life, wherever that might lead them. They talked about their Midwestern roots, the values of integrity, quiet resilience, and hard work that felt so distant from the recent battle they'd fought. They reflected on the steady, unassuming nature of their childhoods, a stark contrast to the glittering, morally ambiguous world they had navigated. Their relationship, forged and tested under immense pressure, emerged stronger, undeniably, but it was also scarred. The compromises, the fear, the constant vigilance, they had etched themselves into the fabric of their shared history. They had faced darkness together, and that shared experience had deepened their bond in ways nothing else could. The pay the price theme resonated deeply within them. Frank Jensen had paid a public and professional price, a spectacular fall from grace. But Sarah and David had also paid a profound personal and moral one, sacrificing pieces of their innocence, their peace of mind, in the arduous pursuit of justice. In the weeks that followed, the immediate storm subsided. They began to talk quietly at first, then with increasing excitement, about starting a family, seeking to build something new and untainted by the darkness they had confronted. One quiet evening, they sat in their living room, looking out over a familiar, tree-lined Midwestern street, the kind of street David remembered from his own childhood. A sense of peace, fragile but real, slowly began to return to their home. The lingering echoes of Frank's threats, his sneering face, served as a stark reminder of the darkness they had faced, a permanent, cautionary part of their shared history. They were embarking on a new beginning, armed with the hard-won wisdom of experience and a deeper, more nuanced understanding of morality and justice. The legal community hummed for weeks. Media outlets, while careful with their words, painted a clear picture of Frank Jensen's abrupt departure. Blackwell, Harding, and Pierce, in turn, offered Sarah a significant promotion and raise, a clear institutional attempt to contain the fallout. Sarah grappled with the implicit pressure to accept, to quietly move on. David watched her, seeing the turmoil, questioning the true cost of their victory. Frank was ruined, but their own lives were irrevocably altered, scarred by the compromises and the calculated fight. After much deliberation, Sarah declined the offer and resigned from the firm. She sought a new path, one where justice felt purer, untainted by the power dynamics she had just escaped. David supported her, ready to leave the cutthroat world behind. They reflected on their Midwestern roots, on integrity and quiet resilience. Their relationship, forged in the crucible of battle, was stronger, yet undeniably marked. Frank had paid a public price, but they had paid a profound personal one. They began to talk of starting a family, looking to build something new, untainted. The lingering echoes of Frank's threats served as a stark reminder of the darkness, a permanent part of their shared history. The end.